But the real ammo is aimed straight at Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and a side helping of Charlottesville. Watch closely. This isn't just political theater. It's a full-blown ideological turf war disguised as bipartisan concern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I want to point out that the CSIS study that's been mentioned here and repeated ad nauseum excluded violence at protests from their study, allowing them to systematically ignore Antifa and Black Lives Matter riots. But they did make an exception for Charlottesville, interestingly. Even using their flawed methodology, CSIS recently reported that left-wing violence in 2025 outpaces right-wing violence. Imagine how much bigger that disparity would be if they actually weren't cooking the books. So without objection, I move to enter into the record an article by Tim Carney explaining CIS's biased methodology. Without objection, will be entered into the record. We'll start with questionings. Mr. Knowles, I want to start with you. You're not going to have any bigger proponent of free speech than me, given especially what I did in my last job and this one. I believe in it wholeheartedly. I think it's the First Amendment is the beating heart of our Constitution. But what we're really talking about here is conduct, of course. Violent conduct. And you've talked about you can't really have this competition in the marketplace if the marketplace is being destroyed and shot up in many instances. How do we get at this problem? What's the road forward in your view?
We might be able to find a little bipartisan agreement if we acknowledge something that both parties at different times have acknowledged, which is that marketplaces of ideas or any other kind of marketplace only function when there are rules and when we abide by those rules. You can't have a marketplace if bandits keep shooting up the marketplace. And this is why it's so important to identify where the threats to the marketplace have really been coming from. Have we seen left-wing speakers shouted down on campuses? Have we seen left-wing events interrupted by terrorists? Rarely so, if ever. I can't think of an occasion. I am amused that Senator Durbin began by warning against pointing to one side or the other, making this a partisan issue, before beginning one of the most partisan invectives that I have ever heard. But I'm not even opposed to a partisan invective here, because I think it is very important that we identify where the threats are. I think any honest Democrat even would have to acknowledge, as the Atlantic magazine did, as even CSIS has acknowledged, that the threats today to the free marketplace of ideas come from the left. And so, in order to restore the open marketplace of ideas, the healthy exchange of ideas, essential to our self-government, we must regulate where the problem is. And today, the problem lies on the left.
Thank you. Mr. Wolf, I want to ask you, and thank you for your service. A common refrain is that Antifa is an ideology, not an organization. Could you talk about, in your experience, how that is complete and utter nonsense, that this is actually a pretty well-coordinated organization with safe houses and money that's laundered internationally, quite frankly, not just domestically?
Yeah, well, I think we've seen that across the country. I think the indictment by the Department of Justice in Texas talks about the Antifa cell there in North Texas, about how they do coordinate, how they do pool their resources. I saw it firsthand in Portland, although it was very difficult to prove at the time. Those types of anarchists and others there being well organized, being well funded, being resupplied daily, not that they were doing that themselves, but that they had help. And so as you look across the spectrum here, is Antifa like other organizations? Does it have a hierarchy and an org chart and everything else? No, it's very different. But that doesn't make it any less dangerous. That doesn't say, and that shouldn't mean from a law enforcement perspective, well, let's not actually investigate. Let's not actually start to look at who these individuals are, how they're organized, how they're funded, how they're financed. Just because they're decentralized doesn't make them any less threatening.
Thank you. Mr. Scheidler, I'm going to go to you and pick up on that point because you alluded to it in your testimony. Understanding what Antifa is and its connections and organization, what are some suggestions you might have of how we could get at this problem of this radical organization hell-bent on destroying America? I mean, this is their stated mission. How do we get about that?
Well, I'm a firm supporter of the President's recommendation to target Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization. There are a number of Antifa organizations that operate across Western Europe and Latin America, which would be justified, we would be justified in designating as a foreign terrorist organization. There are also a number of networks which provide material support, including the one that I mentioned in my testimony, and that is a very common method in which Antifa receives support. much like, for example, Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, where they host media outlets like Dabiq and Inspire, which will give you both ideological instructions as to how to become Antifa, what you need to believe and how you need to believe it. They also provide instructions on what you should do if you wish to be Antifa, including how you should organize, how you can avoid arrest, what encrypted apps to use, what websites to use. They'll also provide instructions on how to destroy critical infrastructure, including 5G wireless communications, and how to derail trains. As, for example, the website It's Going Down did in a case that was related to 2 anarchists in the Pacific Northwest that derailed a number of trains in which the federal government was able to achieve a conviction. So these networks can be targeted for engaging in material support for terrorism. We are not talking about speech. We are talking about manifestos describing how to overthrow the government and how to do that with violence.
Thank you. And President Trump has designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, and I've written to Secretary Rubio for the foreign terrorist organization, and we'll see what happens with that. Ranking Member Welch.
What just went down? Because if you blinked, you might have thought this was a well-intentioned discussion on public safety. Spoiler, it wasn't. What we just sat through was less about how to stop political violence and more about who gets to be labeled dangerous based on which side of the ideological fence they stand on. Let's start with the big bait and switch, the CSIS study. Our dear speaker opens by accusing the study of conveniently excluding violence at protests, except when it involved Charlottesville. So let's get this straight. Studies that acknowledge right-wing violence are cooked, but we're still going to cite them anyway. As long as they admit some left-wing culpability too, that's not logic. That's cherry picking with a flamethrower. And then there's the fascinating linguistic gymnastics around free speech. You've never seen someone champion the First Amendment so hard, only to pivot into, but we must regulate conduct that just so happens to come from the left. Ah yes, the old I love free speech, but routine. Classic. This isn't about ideas, it's about power. Who gets the mic, who gets the mute button, and who gets branded a threat? Let's not forget the recurring phrase, marketplace of ideas. Now that's a cute metaphor, but as Mr. Knowles so passionately put it, you can't have a marketplace if bandits keep shooting it up. Translation, we need rules, but only for the people we don't agree with. If it wasn't so transparently hypocritical, it'd almost be poetic. The second act was where things went off the rails completely. Antifa went from being a loose collection of ideologues to a multinational paramilitary syndicate with safe houses and internationally laundered money. Really? Is this a Senate hearing or the next Jason Bourne installment? Suddenly, we're hearing Antifa has encrypted apps, foreign connections, and is derailing trains. All we're missing is a Bond villain stroking a cat while plotting 5G sabotage. And then came the suggestion, casually thrown in, that Antifa should be designated a foreign terrorist organization. You know, just like ISIS. Because if you're going to go off the rails, why not go full cartoon villain? The logical fallacies in this room could fill a semester-long law school course. We're talking guilt by association, false equivalence, and if it exists on the internet, it must be real logic. Now let's hit pause and remember, this isn't just bluster for the camera. These ideas get baked into policy. They shape what gets investigated, who gets targeted, and what speech is considered acceptable dissent versus criminal conspiracy. The real danger here isn't Antifa or even the ideologues in the room. It's how easily fear becomes law. We also can't ignore the elephant in the chamber, the absence of any serious discussion about right-wing extremism. You know, the one that actually shows up with manifestos, body armor, and oh yeah, actual violence, but shh, let's not disrupt the narrative, because if the blame shifts left, no one has to take a hard look at what's happening on the other side of the aisle, or in the Capitol, or in the comment section of certain politicians. In the end, this wasn't a hearing, it was a performance, a carefully scripted episode in the reality show that is modern American politics, complete with heroes, villains, and a suspenseful soundtrack of manufactured outrage. And like all good reality shows, it leaves you wondering what was real and what was just for show. But here's the bottom line. When hearings like this pass for serious policy discussion, democracy suffers. Because fear is a powerful tool. It just happens to be a terrible guide for making laws. If you made it this far, you definitely have opinions. Drop them in the comments. Was this a necessary reckoning or just partisan grandstanding? Smash that like button if you're tired of political theater passing as truth. Subscribe for more breakdowns that go beyond the spin and into the fire. And hey, next time someone says free speech, ask who's actually being silenced. Because in the end, it's not just about who shouts the loudest, it's about who gets heard.